Call this work session of the Anchorage Assembly to order. We'll start with a roll call. Mr. Croft.
Eric Croft, Assembly.
Forrest Dunbar.
John Weddleton.
Felix Rivera.
Pete Peterson.
Vic Trey.
Austin, could you?
Austin Davidson.
Great. Okay, so we will have a presentation on this, and Mr. Croft, I think it's your show to run.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So even less formal than most work sessions, we wanted it to be emphasis on the work. The resolution that we've put forward, Ms. Dixon and I, establishes, it's a resolution that doesn't change any statutes, ordinances, land use codes. It says a goal, an aspirational goal, having significant portions, if we can, all of Fish Creek daylight until it becomes a creek again. And the maps are really cool for people that have time to look at it. This is, Chris, Shooty, do you remember the date of the old one? Let's see it on here.
Should be on there.
Anyway.
1953 or 4, I believe.
Yeah, early 50s here, and then relatively current here. And that's part of the problem. We've built up over what was a creek, a kind of a marshy and slow-flowing creek. It was marsh and creek, and now is all kinds of different things. Some places it is still there; they're not flowing regularly. A lot of places it's built over, and I get so far two very different types of reaction to this. Great, that'd be fun. When is it going to be open? Like, people expect it to be done tomorrow, right? And people who have land there, buildings on it, or development plans, who say, what the heck are you doing? You're going to take away my property or affect mine. And I really think it's neither, right? It is not going to be done tomorrow, and there are places on this aspirational, along the creek, this aspirational goal of doing it, that are either impossible or really, really hard. And it probably have to be a culvert underneath. Maybe someday we could, but they're certainly, it's hard to see how that would work. And somewhere it's almost already done, and you're just connecting it up or calling these things. And a lot that's in between. Before, I wish he hadn't left, but before Mr. Dyson left, who's my good curmudgeon, reality check on a lot of things, said, how are you going to pay for this craft? And I said, the paper is easy. The resolution, like, it only costs $100 to print these up. But I think I know what he meant. I said, look, but he said after a while, so you just establish the goal, and then you at least don't move backwards, right? So you at least have said, let's make sure that as we do new things, we've got this idea in mind. And where we can, let's put it together. Jay Stain, who I grew up, reminded me that the Laney Fleischer Trail, the Chester Creek Trail, ended at C? Was it where we go over? Hey.
They have this, good afternoon. They have this really
I'm sorry, can you identify yourself for the record?
Yeah, Jay Stain, Bernard Community Council. I'm also a director of community development at Neighborhoods Alaska, and board member of Friends of Fish Creek. So, Eric, the Laney Fleischer Chester Creek methodology I thought was fascinating because she asked me at one point if I'd ever been paying attention at all, which sounded to me a lot like from my old high school teachers. And I said, well, I paid attention when I used to have to carry my bike over the Minnesota bypass, climb over the guardrail, walk across the pavement and down the other side to get through a corridor that I really wanted to travel on. And she said, yeah, that was a purposeful thing. And I certainly don't want to suggest that we should send anybody over the guardrail on Minnesota bypass, but that's what worked to sort of get the city's attention in that case of a need in the community.
I got ahead of myself just because of the maps, but Jay and Karen, do you want to just introduce yourselves briefly and maybe a short, I wanted it as much to be questions, possible impacts, problems, but I'd love you guys to just say something.
Yeah, this is Karen Button, who's the board president of Friends of Fish Creek, and I introduced myself. I wanted to just say in general that this idea that I've been talking with people in the community about actively for many years now, is really more than a creek daylighting project. I feel that in Midtown and Spenard, where I've lived since 1975, we have a need that Eric Croft actually expressed to me in an excellent question one day informally. He said, how do we inspire development in Midtown and in Spenard when we've been pretty much stuck there for 40 years with not much happening other than a couple isolated commercial sectors in Spenard and of course the entire Midtown commercial expansion? How do we inspire residential development? And one of my best answers for Eric, which I'm not sure if he completely buys into yet or not, but I feel that we need to give people a reason to live in Midtown. We need to give people a reason to live in Eastern Spenard. And I think that if we can have the city act as a leader in pointing to a plan down the road that talks about greenway supported development from the 2040 plan, talks about creating an amenity in Midtown that people would want to live around. If you ask anybody in the city what the best features for living are, they'll talk about the Chester Creek Bike Trail, they'll talk about the Tony Mills Coastal Trail. And you know, for the amount of money that was spent on the construction of those projects, there was a lot of return in terms of leveraged private investment. And so what I am proposing with this daylighting project as my long-term idea is let's give people a reason to build homes in Midtown. And let's give people a reason to build homes in Eastern Spenard and to develop this area. We don't have to pay for it all ourselves at the city level. People will pay for it if they have a reason to live there. And so I'm proposing that we have an amenity that runs from the UMed district someday down the Fish Creek drainage, which is between 36th Avenue and 40th Avenue, and across the Seward Highway or under the Seward Highway at some point, connects to the jewel of Midtown, Cuddy Family Park, and then continues on down the Fish Creek drainage through Spenard and through Turnagain and out to the ocean at the Tony Mills Coastal Trail. Many of those segments are under construction right now, and connecting the dots on those has been a joyous process. This part that we're talking about from Minnesota Boulevard east is a heavy lift. But I think that we're not asking for the Assembly to allocate monies or even allocate design funds at this time. We're just asking this to be kept in mind as a planning goal so that as we develop our city, because I don't see any shortage of construction projects being proposed in Midtown, I think that we can have significant cost savings by creating natural greenway supported development that catches water instead of continuing to spend $20 and $30 and $40 million a year on sewer pipe. So I think in the long run it makes sense as an amenity to attract investment and also as a public utility investment. A lot of the pipe that's in the ground in this area is 30, 40 years old, and it's going to come out. If you want to talk to somebody about pipe, just talk to the people who are doing 32nd and 33rd right now. It's a lot cheaper to have a greenway supported development with creek swales than it is to put in sewer pipe. And I think that ultimately some of the people in this room who have expressed support for a stormwater utility are really ahead of the curve and could save us a lot of money over time if we can start thinking about this waterway. You can't change gravity no matter how much time and no matter how much money there is. You can't change gravity, so let's use it and let's have a vision for our city that increases value. It's my basic pitch.
Karen, that was Jay being brief. Did you want to say anything? And I want to bring Jeff Urbanus up on hydrology. You got time?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's both practical, there's a lot of difficulties to this. One is there are buildings on things, but another is just the gravity, hydrology, and of it. So we want to get to that. Was there anyone here that wanted to say something briefly, or is everyone else here for do it as we go? Did you go ahead?
Yeah. Tyler Robinson, Cook Inlet Housing, and I guess I would say, as it relates to Fish Creek and I guess what you call the east end of Fish Creek, if you will, which is really that part of Midtown, not going all the way to UMed, but where Cook Inlet has been acquiring property to do a redevelopment. And there was a time, not too long ago, where we referred to the piece of creek or remnant creek that exists in our area as a ditch. And we got in a lot of trouble right? With people in the community that want it to be a lot more than a ditch, that recognize that it was a really nice amenity at one point, and it can be again. And what we have been working on is kind of practical solutions for what we can do in the interim, but also have the interim solution not preclude an ultimate vision of a restored and daylighted creek. And so I think in talking to Jeff earlier and others and talking to Jay, I think there's a way that we can move forward with a development that uses, and the area that I'm talking about actually is one of those places where it does not flow currently regularly. But it is functioning as, it does have serve a drainage function, and it can in fact serve a greater green function. It can look a little bit better. And so we believe that there's a path forward where there's an interim solution that allows it to be an important part of green infrastructure, supporting millions of dollars of housing investment, but also be available for a future flowing creek if in fact that happens. And I think that's important to kind of keep both of those interim and long-term solutions kind of in mind when we think about these aspirational.
You guys think there's a way to do some of the development that you want without foreclosing the creek, but not adding so much cost to your project?
What I'm saying is we'll preserve effectively a corridor, but we'll be allowed to work within that corridor, not putting structures in the corridor, but be able to use that corridor as open space, as revegetated space, as something that looks nice.
Let me say it this way, if I call it a creek, a bunch of things happen into our code, including you not being able to put structures within sometimes 20, sometimes
Right.
25 or 50.
We're not sure yet. We'll do that.
Yeah, so we're working on that. That's why I'm
Proposed is 25 in Fish Creek. But
And
yes.
so what we might need to do for your project is to say, you're preserving it, you're not foreclosing it, but you can do things that wouldn't ordinarily be allowed, like maybe some structures in this area where when we call it a creek, that isn't traditionally allowed.
I think that what Jeff's interpretation and Chris's interpretation is that if the stream ordinance passes, there's a section on alternative compliance, and it specifically mentions greenway and stream restoration projects. That within that, the corridor would be preserved in effect, but we'd be able to do things like put raised garden beds in that area, which you may not normally be able to do in a stream setback, right? So be able to do those things. And what I think is really cool, and hopefully Jay's on board with this, is I think by actually improving that area, we contribute to enhance the vision of a future creek, because we start to point it out as a real positive amenity and start telling the story about it. And so we build support by doing it. Whereas, honestly, we've been stuck with this thing for 5+ years. I think we're at the cusp of being able to move forward with it.
Eric, we have some questions. So I'm going to go with Mr. Weldon first.
So to get clear, so I'm familiar with the rock. Is the location of the creek fine, or would you like to move the creek and accommodate your building, but leave it daylighted and make something that looks more like a creek?
I think it's fine. The location is fine. What we're suggesting is, if we can't touch it, if we can't revegetate, if we treat it more as a true creek setback, which we would love to if it were flowing as a creek, then if we can't touch it, then we're building around. Literally, the edge of our landscaping stops, and there's this DMZ zone that just kind of looks like it looks today. It's hard to envision that as an amenity in a housing. So I believe we're basically, do we have the ability to treat it as though it's a floodplain effectively, even though it's not, right? But treat it that way, enhance it. But if that creek ever came through, we wouldn't be having issues with where I put my building. Does that make sense?
Do you want to get in there and change the trees and the vegetation and put your own in there?
Maybe a footbridge over it, because I watch people walk across to get to the bus every day,
Okay, but I'm not aware that the stream setback ordinance would limit that, would it?
It does, well, particularly if you look at what we. Sorry, I'm Jennifer Manns from the Watershed Management Services. One of the problems with the code as it exists today, just beyond the distance of the setbacks, is it's pretty on the things that are allowed to be done. And in many cases, Tyler used the term like DNC. You can't do anything there. And in lots of places, that's appropriate. But when we look at these things, like we talk about the problems with Fish Creek, we talk about the problems with Chester Creek, Bird Creek, some of the areas that have had not great development decisions made in the past, and we look to the purpose of why you have a stream setback code in the first place, protection from erosion, flooding, icing, water quality, all of those things. You look at like the property there at Chugash Way, there's a linear path of water, and there is some vegetation, but clearly there are things that could be done there that would make that a better space, both a better space for the creek, a better space for the community, a better space in terms of like as an amenity on his property. And so I'm looking at things like
I think his answer is maybe.
No, the Moulton property and the greenhouse property, those are good examples of getting something back and working with a property that's being redeveloped. So we tried in 2012, I don't think we did a great job. In this ordinance is language that talks about when we're looking at a redevelopment situation and someone comes to the municipality and says, look, I have an entitlement that allows me to do this, I'm willing to give up part of that and do maybe something like, we're never going to recreate something in Fish Creek that looks like Far North Bicentennial Park. Like, it's just not going to look like it. But it can look a lot better than what it is today. And I think that's the direction that we're trying to go with things like this, which I think speaks to what you're talking about in terms of having like green space in the community along Fish Creek. And it's never going to look like it looked like in 1920, but it could look better than it looks now.
Okay. Yeah?
The new stream setback ordinance will help if not hurt.
Absolutely.
I believe it does, yeah. Yeah, he convinced me of that. And
But one of the reasons we didn't say, you shall consider the Fish Creek a stream under the stream ordinance with all the rights thereof is because of that, right? We intentionally didn't say, you shall in this area. We said, we have a goal of this, and we want it to be as flexible as possible so that these discussions happen, not that we mandate a thing that may not fit.
And I don't think existing code it may not prohibit, but it certainly makes those discussions more difficult, the code that's in effect today, because it is a thou shalt not thing, and then it's kind of mum about the rest of it.
Good. So I have a question, although I think it might be answered, but Jeff was going to speak shortly, right, about
Yeah, I sort of wanted
hydrology?
to see if there anyone else who wanted to briefly say some concern before I let Jeff talk some hydrology.
And Eric, just one more, one question that I would ask that you all consider as you're looking at the resolution, and that is just, what does this resolution have any bearing on future entitlement applications? So you go to the planning board, you go to the P&Z for rezoning, this resolution's out there. Is there any sort of regulatory requirement as a result of it? And so those of us that sit on boards and commissions and do development, we wonder those things. So I think we ought to there ought to be some conversation about that.
Well, it's a resolution, so it's persuasive but not controlling.
Well, I think the concern, right, is, okay, so we do a resolution, that doesn't do anything. If you say, and it should be part of the 2040 plan, then it starts to have things, because then we do rezones that need to be in conformity with it, and things that you want to do might not be. So that's another step in the thing from resolution to ordinance, is it's part of our planning process, and sometimes thou shalt not get a rezone if you don't fit the plan. Is that some of your concern?
I think that there would be developers that would be very concerned about this. There would be community members that would want it to be contemplated, but because it's so vague and so unknown of where we would put anything, it creates a lot of unknowns if you on both sides. And that's my only. I think it's great. I just think we need to understand those implications.
So, Chris, what are the implications? I'm coming to you as part of it. What are the implications of a resolution? It's not necessarily part of the 2040 plan, right?
It says it's compatible with.
Through the chair, Chris Schutte, Director of Economic Community Development. That's correct. And I think the answer to your question kind of lies in the resolution statement. It tells you sort of exactly what the purpose of this is. It says you guys are expressing your support. That's great. You find it's compatible with the 2040 area plan. 2040 acreage area plan, type with the 2040 plan, great. And that you encourage action by both the administration and the community to support daylighting. And then further, that you encourage the establishment of a continuous east-west non-motorized corridor, the streamway corridor that people have been speaking about, and calls on departments to prioritize protecting and enhancing. So I think there's the way that I would read this is it provides aspirational direction for everybody in the community, from municipal departments to the public. It does not necessarily direct a board or commission to take a given action as a result of this. But as you articulated, if there are things that exist where they do have to base their judgments, then that's what they'll look to, and a lot of that reflects this too.
Okay. Anybody besides Mr. Bonneville? Yeah. Did you?
I wanted to jump in, and I had planned on talking later, but as long as we're now talking about participation, property rights, how current and future review agencies and/or departments may interpret this or utilize this. It's always easier to implement something on a larger basis than to pick apart instead of one property and try and figure out how to make it work. When you have already established individual lots, and each one of those might get hit with a chunk of this greenway, open space, creekway, and that it gets really hard because now you're impacting a greater percentage of the specific lot based on yard setbacks, front yard setbacks, lot coverage, everything else. You may not even be able to count that part that is in the greenway that would require open space. So I don't know what the rules will be. But when I see language like this, that effectively the assembly has called upon municipal departments to prioritize protecting and enhancing sections of Fish Creek, that as Tyler has brought up, there will be folks within the current administration and departments that will look at that differently and rightfully or wrongfully potentially impose or create implications associated with development of property that will be very difficult to get around. So based on my experience, I'm just suggesting, and then I'll go back to the real root basis of any comments I will make here today, is that there should be a flexible roadmap clarified in advance of this kind of effort so that those parties that are going to get hurt worse get taken into account and are accommodated in some fashion. And we haven't really done any greenbelt acquisition since back in the late 70s with Campbell Creek and some of that. And why haven't we? Well, let's go to the root of this whole thing. It's all going to come down to money and the ability to implement anything. Rightfully or wrongfully, we decided as a city a long time ago to not design around gravity, which is kind of a governing thing.
It's just a theory.
Just a theory. And I'm not going to ask Trump this that, but as Dick knows, I've been harping about this for a couple of terms of his going back in time, that cities need to try and take advantage of the situation and understand that stormwater, whether it's in a ditch, in a creek, or in a pipe, is a functional infrastructure of the city and the government's responsibility, just as water or sewer is.
Okay, I need to move on. Got one more fascinating point you want to make for us?
I'm not objecting to this, but I think there needs to be clarity, and I think there needs to be some additional clarity in the alternate design approach that we really do accommodate some flexibility.
Flexibility.
And I just want everybody to think about the Bridge Restaurant, which was built on basically the first highway bridge across Ship Creek. And knowing that that had to get a variance to be built on, is that an asset, and does it do anything to limit or impact the Ship Creek area? And can we even think about the flexibility? Since it's going to come down to a square footage development basis, could there be alternative designs that actually built over the top of the creek, still accommodating corridors and greenways and everything else, that will allow you to take advantage of that square foot.
Flexibility, got it. Karen, do you want to?
Yeah, wow, okay. My name's Karen Button, and I'm the board president of Friends of Fish Creek, and a lifetime star president, actually. I feel that a lot of this resolution to me feels very positive because, in part, it's an affirmation that sets out a broad overview, and it's not giving specific direction. I feel like it's too big. You know, we're going to get to those points later for sure. When I read this piece here, I'm sorry, I didn't get introduced. Okay. Oh, okay. Nice to meet you. This is actually calls on municipal departments to prioritize protecting and enhancing sections of Fish Creek that are currently daylit. So as that portion of it, I hear what you're saying. I feel like that one of the issues that we have with Fish Creek, of course, is the lack of identity, because it's not prioritized, it's not identified, it's not, and it's not daylit. You know, I think that one of the things that we're going to be seeing as we move forward with this is that there's a increased community responsibility that people will embrace. You know, we just had Fish Creek cleanup at the Fish Creek Festival the other day, and it was shocking to me in 1 year how much garbage was in Fish Creek in a very small section between Spinard Road and Kiwanis Fish Creek Park. So
I just want to say that I hope that nothing I said suggests that I'm not supporting.
yeah, no, I didn't hear it that way.
And that I hope that this is
Let her finish.
a ratification of having a utility so that there's money to do the things that
Right,
everybody
right.
wants. Because this is a public request through the comprehensive plan and everything else we do. And if the public wants it, the public ought to be able to put a little bit of the money in it.
Problem with giving him the floor is sometimes we don't get it back.
Yeah, no, I didn't hear that you were at all speaking against it, but more speaking very to some specifics that I feel in a way we might be getting out ahead of ourselves. I think it's really, I feel like it's very positive. Thanks Tyler for bringing up some of the concerns that you have, because I think it's important as we move forward to know where some of those specifics need to be addressed.
I'll be happy to do that. But Tyler and I have different views and some of them because we work in this every day trying to get this done.
Sure, I understand.
And have an endless supply of inconsistency and different approaches to the answer requirement.
Got it.
And that makes it really hard for us to be able to actually get to the point of making all these.
Wait a minute, stop interrupting her. Are you done?
You know what? I will.
You don't have to be.
No,
I just meant
no.
I'm going to tell him not to interrupt you anymore.
No,
And
it's
that's
okay.
not going to do any good.
Let's move forward, and if there's any specific questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I'd like to move to Jeff telling us some of the hydrological issues or problems with it. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, so I had two questions.
Okay, go.
Sorry. Very quickly, can anyone here tell me how to pronounce this? Because I have to do it on Tuesday night.
Good luck.
No, but seriously. I mean, I think it's important too. If we care about the Naina folks, and we're doing this, one of the reasons because the Naina land. Is there anyone here who actually represents the Naina people or could speak this language?
We got that from the sources. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jim Fall, who is one of the co-authors of Shumpeats, Alaska, is here in Anchorage, and he.
Can you have him send us a phonetic?
I was
way
going
we're
to.
supposed
Well,
to
he
pronounce
says it is phonetic.
It just
Well,
is.
but there's letters in here that aren't in the English language. so.
Right, but it is like the letter L with the slash through it. That's phonetic, which it's like the sound that we can't pronounce if we're taught speaking English. But I could ask him to please do a phonetic. Maybe he can record it.
Give us a little help on
Yeah.
maybe both of us, but one of us is going to have to read it on Tuesday.
Yeah.
So that's
Good point.
my first question. My second is, I guess this gets into the hydrology question. So I want to hear a little more about, and I received sort of an informal briefing about the pipes and the flow and the history, and I think it's really interesting. I'm also curious, if you were to target just like 100 feet, say, or 300 feet, if 100 can't be done, practically, like give me the smallest discrete unit that we could actually realistically daylight in the near future. I'd like to hear that. I think it's...
Yeah, so I apologize. Somehow I got dropped off the invite for this, so I'm going to do this a little bit on the fly. Luckily, when Tyler and I were talking to Fish Creek this morning, he said, "Here you come this afternoon." So is there a specific, beyond the input that you just gave, is there a specific aspect to the hydrology that would be helpful for this discussion that I can emphasize? Otherwise, I could just sort of say, here's kind of how things work, here are some of the challenges, here are some of the opportunities.
Mr. Trainee?
My question is, does the creek bed itself lend itself to hydrology to moving the water? Are we going to constantly be fighting with nature? It's going to try and move the challenge where it wants to go.
So it's kind of a two-part story. So if and I unfortunately I can look at the map, but it's not easy to share. If you think, for kind of starting with a simple concept, everything west of Arctic on Fish Creek is more or less the original channel, and it's more or less daylighted, for lack of a better word. If we look east of Arctic, traveling, you said, like you're the drainage, 36 to 40th, kind of all the way back across the Seward Highway. There are portions around Tudor and Lake Otis that are open through like the Waldron Homestead and that area. And then eventually the original headwaters for Fish Creek were behind the OPA building. There's like a little escarpment there below the mental health the facility there. And that's like there were springs that were there. I can't verify this. I've actually been told if you go to the OPA building down in the basement and put your hair head to the floor drain, you can actually still hear the water.
Go check that out.
Yeah.
So in terms of like,
I live on Campbell Creek, and right now it's just a straight line. That wasn't how nature intended Campbell Creek to be.
so this map, and I can send this to anyone or do whatever. One of the things that's interesting about Fish Creek and Spenard is that like when I was doing the research to sort of figure out where the historical channel was, going back to 1950 was not far enough back. I actually had to go back to the 39 imagery because there were changes in Spenard for so long. Tyler's portion of the property is like kind of what you're talking about. It's more or less where the channel was. Certainly it's been straightened. Most of the rest of it is pretty good. One of the things that's difficult in your question about like I just want to pick a piece of stream to daylight. If you think about and you think about Fish Creek, like I don't know, like down near Barbara Street or whatever it is, often Fish Creek is pretty incised and is quite a bit lower in elevation than a lot of the adjacent development. So if you think about the impacts of that with something like Cuddy Midtown Park, the elevation of that pond, that's the elevation of the stream. So that's why, like when you park, you pull in the park to go walk around the pond, you're 10 feet higher than the elevation of the creek because so much filling has taken place in that area between Lake Otis and Arctic. So when you think about daylighting in this like midtown corridor here, you're even like, let's just say you wanted 10 feet for the creek, some sort of a buffer on either side, and then you look at the elevation difference and figure like kind of like a minimum, so like a 2-to-1 slope, you're kind of pretty quickly in, over 100 feet for a corridor just for the bare minimum. So that's one of the challenges for daylighting.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Please
Well, I'm still. I asked him a question too, and he's still working to answer my question as well.
So it's quite it's not as simple as like just ripping up a pipe and then just letting it run, because gravity is such that that water is below the ground surface. So you either have to dig down to it, like in the case of Cuddy Pond, or you have to bring it back up to the surface, which is one of the challenges over by 36 and like Chugach Way, is Fish Creek's in the 36th Avenue storm drain there, and then there's Tyler's stream channel. Sorry, it's yours now. There's like a 6.5 foot elevation difference there.
You mean the pipes are well underneath the stream bed?
You got to get the water up into the stream bed, and that's either done by digging down or pumping the water up to the surface. And so then that just gets into a question of like, from a public works standpoint, maintenance, facilities, all that kind of thing. Do we want to do that? I don't, you know, that's a question for someone else to answer. But it is a factor.
Is it also the case, so, you know, we have this sort of remarkable success in Pete and my district with Chester Creek, where there's fish now all the way up, you know, all the way up to past Muldoon.
Yep.
And, you know, this remarkable resilience, and they made it all the way up. But it sounds like what you're saying is Fish Creek, it would be much more difficult to get fish actually through a significant portion of it because of these kind of pumping and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so one of the things, like, you could probably get fish pretty easy, like all the way maybe up to like 36 without major civil works kind of projects.
Okay.
But east of there,
Well,
I'm not quite sure. And you also have to look, and I don't want to get into like a whole fish thing. There needs to be, I mean, for there to be fish there has to be spawning habitat. And so like the Chester Creek example, those fish are going to the base because that's where the spawning gravels are and all the rest of it. So you might have like the ability to get fish to point A, but actually there's nothing there for maybe like pinks or something could find some spawning habitat lower down. But so there becomes a problem, because I think to follow your idea the whole entire way, like if you sat at, you know, some point like on Minnesota and envisioned like something going east, I mean, you're talking about like a big excavation all the way back because of,
Right.
you'd have to stay at that elevation going the whole
but
way.
fish can go through a culvert. I mean, they can go through some kind of pipe for a while if there was spawning grounds at
Yes.
the end, right? So could we build spawning grounds at 36?
Well,
I mean,
there's
just-
the thing. Well, I guess there's nothing really. The problem is Fish Creek's been kind of built up going down.
Yeah.
So you almost have to rebuild it going up. But that's, like I said, that's not to say that I mean, dollies, rainbows, you know, pinks, those sorts of things. I just don't think you're going to see. I guess I was just saying I don't think you're going to see as dramatic. No matter what's on, you're not going to see as a dramatic thing as happened on Chester Creek. That doesn't mean you couldn't have lots of good things happen.
Yep.
So I mean, Jay, one of the things you talked about, which I think different parts of the watershed, like a greenway means different things. And so it doesn't mean, you know, like one of the things we talked about too was like, you know, an opportunity for education about what happens with urbanization of streams. And so you have like whether it's like a bike trail or something like that, that goes through the traditional drainage and explains like, well, actually where you're standing right now, you know, Fish Creek's 10 feet below the surface and this is what happens and that kind of thing. But you would still get that connection that would go from the ocean all the way east to like, you know, University District. One of the other things interesting about hydrology in Fish Creek, and I don't think it speaks for or against anything in the resolution, but I think it's worthwhile being in people's heads. In '89, there was a pretty tremendous flood that impacted lots of different places in Anchorage, but significantly Fish Creek, like in, you know, like Iowa, that area, to oh yeah, we got pictures. So like, we're not talking like floods. We're talking like things you see after hurricanes, people in john boats, you know, water up to the top of pickup trucks, that sort of thing. And ever since then, or starting then, there was tens of $1 million multi-phase capital project to try and not have that happen again. One component of which was fixing the crossings, the stream crossings at the streets and where those were constrictions. To my knowledge, those are all been done with McRae having finished recently. One part of it was preserving places for water flood storage in the upper watershed, so that would include County Park was a big part of that, but also the acquisition of Walter Homestead, the Helen Louise McDowell Sanctuary, so that those waters can be stored in the upper part of the flood waters. And this is maybe what I mean in terms of flexibility approach. You're never going to get natural hydrology back in the watershed, but you take advantage of the opportunity so that you're sort of like mimicking what would happen when you're storing water in the upper watershed, so it doesn't all just, scream down to the Harley Davidson dealership.
They could switch to jet skis.
Yeah. So, but part of that also too, which should be any discussion of like pumping water. We're actually intentionally diverting water from Fish Creek now. There's a control structure in the intersection of 36 in Minnesota. I know it's not an intersection, but the road alignment that, under normal circumstances, directs flow south down Minnesota into Fish Creek, right around like there's like a paving guy there or something that sometimes has like big fire ring things on the side of the highway there, or Minnesota. That's where the water goes out of 36th Avenue, so down storm drain south, and then down the creek and around and all the way, and then out to the inlet. But when under high flow circumstances, it actually bypasses the majority of the flows due west and then north, and then it rejoins Fish Creek at Hermit Park, just right around where the railroad crossing is. So any discussion about putting more water in would also have to keep that same balancing act. So it's not as simple as let's say you figured out a way to get water into Chugach, you'd also have to make sure that you preserve that thing. And so that's just an engineering thing, but I think it's, in terms of the underlying hydrology of the watershed, that's kind of an important thing to have in mind.
Questions? So I was hoping you could take a stab at, or maybe someone else could take a stab at my very sort of basic question of pick 100 feet, pick 500 feet. Where is the most likely place we could get water back in or something daylighted? At any point along here. Jay, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So you guys are probably aware of Cathio Estates and L&L Trailer Park, which is in this we've been calling it the 36th 40th Avenue project area, and it's been loosely defined in a lot of different discussions that Chris has been having with AMAT and other planning agencies, and the Community Council and Spinard has also talked a lot about this area. J.J. Brooks, a developer there, has been for a number of years contemplating a development in that area, and we've talked to J.J. Over time about whether he'd be willing to consider having an amenity of Fish Creek running through a development that he might do there. And at various times he's been supportive, other times not. Most recently he's not supportive. But one of the ideas is to have a lift station temporarily for us at 36th Avenue, right near where Arctic crosses over is, if you look at the 1950 stream channel, you can see that there's actually an actual archival channel that's right at the corner of 36th and Arctic, essentially on the north side of Arctic and on the west, the north side of 36th and the west of Arctic. And so a possible pump station or a lift station as a temporary or a beginning stage at that point, I think is possible. And the current creek mapping that's on Cook Inlet Housing's property goes all the way to the borderline of L&L Trailer Park. And then the Wilshire residents that have the creek channel, the archival channels in their backyard. So one possible idea would be to work out an arrangement with JJ and with Cook Inlet Housing and with the Wilshire residents to put water in the old channel through their backyards and on the property line. Maybe not a large channel, but it would definitely need to be facilitated by a lift station. So that would be maybe an introductory phase 1 idea.
Jeff, you want to explain why we can't do that?
I mean, a lift station. I'm not speaking for or against it, but just generally, they're kind of viewed as problematic because you just when we have to use them, this is more of like a better question for street maintenance. I mean, we like gravity to keep things flowing, and when the lift station doesn't work, water stops flowing. So it's a point of failure, and I don't know. We haven't really gone down the road of pumping stormwater. I mean, it's certainly possible from an engineering perspective. It's just a question of, you know, I mean, it would need to be done in a way of some of the other concerns I talked about, but you would need to put a lift station in 36 to lift the creek back up out of the thing and into channel. And one of the things we talked about, you know, this morning, Tyler, was recognizing that that type of thing could happen in the future and might happen in the future, and so it was kind of important to preserve that space through cooking the housing property. So it certainly could be done. I think that's a lot more realistic than digging down at that property down to the channel, because then you'd certainly be confronted when you got to cook inlet housing with what are you going to do when it's back up 6 feet again. So it's just a philosophical question and somewhat of a practical question in terms of maintenance responsibilities, whether or not we lift water out of storm drains to the surface. And I certainly don't possess the answers to that. I mean, I could.
Mr. Welton, I don't know, Mr. Croft or Ms. Davidson, do you have some closing thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yeah, just as we're getting close, this, you know, I like the idea. I mean, look at Chester Creek Sound. It's hard to imagine Anchorage without that. And to me, it's amazing to have Leonard Fleischer, John Reese, and these other people who made that happen still here. It's inspiring to know them, be friends with them. And this could be next, this kind of thing. But I worry about it a bit because certainly Fish Creek, but there's other creeks, Furrow Creek. We should do more there. It's a lot of opportunity. I could name other creeks all through South Anchorage. This should be the priority, okay? What happens here when you say, particularly as we're prioritized, worries me. It won't always be my priority. We spent over $1 million for a relatively short connection on Fish Creek Trail with a bridge, okay? $1 million. They're super nice. These connections should have been left originally, so we didn't have to do that. We're going back and fixing the things we lost. But as you go forward, then, okay, sure, $1 million lift station to do multi-million-dollar daylighting. Is that a priority? He's super nice, but there's a lot of bike lanes for a couple $1 million. Those are also a priority of interest to me. So a lot of stuff on the hillside, access to GSA Park, access to the Rabbit Creek Greenbelt to Griffith Park. We need to work out. There's a whole bunch of things that could be a lot cheaper. But if this is the priority, prioritized, then those can't happen because they're not the priority. So I would recommend, and will recommend, a small wording change at least here, maybe more, but just your second to last line, 39 on page 2, just change it departments to protect and enhance sections of Fish Creek. Get rid of that word prioritize. Because we have lots and lots of opportunities like Fish Creek throughout the city that we will prioritize them based on cost benefit, not resolution.
I might just add, I think there's lots of other things that could be done too. I mean, properties become available, there's an opportunity to increase repair. I mean, I think everyone likes the idea of daylighting because it's dramatic and it's like, wow, this is like an awesome project, and we're undoing the mistakes of the past. And I would just say that there's like lots of the opportunities come up time to time that, you know, to purchase properties to maybe get back riparian area and do some of those restorations and like different projects through the portions that are open channel. Just because it's open channel doesn't mean, and I'm only because I didn't mention earlier, there are certainly opportunities for improvement of the existing channel, and maybe if that's part of the suite of things that's in the resolution, there's a tool there to make it a better creek.
Austin, did you want to say anything? That wording change is fine with me. Austin and I will work on that, as well as Mr. Potter's suggestion that, and I'd had, I think, a sentence in the prior version that simply said, doing anything on this is going to take a lot of flexibility, and we're not locking into any particular. But we'll try and get some language that will reassure both you and Tyler. We know that this is an unusual situation that is often going to need unusual and exceptions and different kind of thinking if we're going to make any progress on it. Did anyone else want to say anything before we wrap up here at 2:30? You already did. And if you'll promise to be really brief.
You know, that's really hard for me to do that. But I do want to underscore that, you know, the sin of the past is that we fought Mother Nature for a long time. And there have been times back in the late 70s where we actually had some money. We prioritized it to see the value of creating green spaces along creek drainages. You know, Mother Nature figured out storm drainage a long time ago, and we need to try and get back to that, and it's going to be a financial benefit utility, the population, the leaders need to understand how much money we are faced with fixing or dealing with a failing stormwater system. If we had a utility, a portion of the revenue went to acquisition of existing non-developed lands or even future. My dream out of the stormwater utility is that there are properties along some of the creek borders, there's Chester Creek, Campbell, or Fish, or Furrow Creek, that we actually give rights of first refusal so that when people die or they sell, the city has a cash deposit.
All right, Tim, I gotta
they can
go.
look
I
at.
got 2 minutes for other people.
Okay.
Tim's been around long enough. He knew Mother Nature way back.
We need a 50-year plan.
All right. Anybody else? Eugene, you want to grade us? No. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I live along Chester Creek, the far east end, and we have seen fish there the last couple of years since we straightened out, moved the stream bed down there near Muldoon. And since then, we've had more bear activity. We can't prove one way or another whether that had any effect on the bear activity, but we definitely know we've seen more bears over the last several years than we had previous to that. Just some information.
Just another benefit of doing this. More bears. I just want to say, Tim, I don't think you have a lot of opposition to a stormwater utility in this room, actually. I think you've done a pretty good job evangelizing, and I certainly am supportive if the numbers come back from the study and it's something you can actually set up. So I will close this work session unless there's a member of the public that wishes to speak. No? Okay. We're adjourned.